Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. This segment is presented by Charles Schwab. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us this afternoon, we have Evan Rogers, co-founder and CEO of True Anomaly, Tien, CEO of Mattermost, and Araz Feyzi, co-founder and CTO of Kayhan Space. We're here to discuss the evolution of the threat and economic landscapes at the intersection of space and cybersecurity. Of course, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. Evan, let's kick it off with you. Give us some background of where True Anomaly sits within the space ecosystem.
Jill, thanks for the time. It's great to be here. So True Anomaly is a defense tech company for space superiority products. Space is no longer a peaceful domain. It is contested. It is actively under attack by our adversaries. And we're in the early stages of a sophisticated and complex arms race in space with Russia and China in particular. True Anomaly builds the capabilities, the software, the platforms, the spacecraft, and the payloads that are required for the United States and its allies to protect and defend its interests in the space domain.
And Ian, tell us about the work you're doing at Mattermost.
So Mattermost, we're a dual-use company for sensitive information. We're a collaboration suite that works with enclaves and air-gapped environments where a lot of the sensitive data from space and operations will reside.
And finally, tell us about Kayhan.
Kayhan Space is a software company. We focus on space situation awareness, space domain awareness, and autonomy. We ingest data from various data sources such as ground-based sensors, space-based sensors, satellites themselves. We bring them all together, fuse them. That gives us a really good picture of where everything is and what we think the intention of these objects are. And we also help coordinate between satellite operators how they're going to maneuver around each other to keep everybody safe. Our mission is to keep space flight safer.
Evan, how are the evolving threats transforming the economics of the warfare of space?
Well, actually, the economics are largely driving the threats. So the reduction of launch costs has been a significant driver in the ability to access space, both for the United States and our competitive adversaries, particularly the People's Republic of China. So it's just easier and less expensive to get to space. And we're finally seeing what we call the Cambrian explosion of space technologies, where you have the ability to build purpose-built systems, not just for military capabilities and utilization, but also for commercial uses, really for the first time ever. And suddenly there's a huge attack surface associated with the space domain, both in the physical domain and the cyber domain, that's exposed really for the first time at scale. Finally, space capabilities are used now writ large by most of the developed economies on the planet. So used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, communications, environmental monitoring, et cetera. And they're a critical part of the backbone of the way that the Western economy has evolved. And that incentivizes our adversaries to see those systems as targets really for the first time.
So Araz's dual use nature means that any, whether it's commercial use or for defense usages, any vulnerability with a satellite can impact the entire system.
That's absolutely true. And the line is really blurred between commercial, civil, and also defense use of satellite assets these days. You wake up in the morning, you check the weather, you check your navigation to work. All of that data is coming from satellites to you, and are supported. Every aspect of our modern life is supported by space technology. The timing that traders get on stock exchange floor comes from satellites. So those exact same satellites that are providing these services to us are also providing the national security and intelligence services to our DoD and intelligence community, providers and services. So all of a sudden, if there is a conflict, all of a sudden every asset that's providing these dual use capabilities is a target, right? So yes, the line is blurred, and attack surface is large. It is very different from a software as a service solution that you're hosting on a cloud that has its own type of surface attack surface. But when you think about the whole stack of operations, that from ground segment to ground stations that do the communication to satellite itself, which is a flying computer, all of a sudden you have a massive attack surface that you have to protect.
Yeah. Ian, this may be a remedial question, but is there a regulatory body that is doing air traffic control, if you will, in the space environment? What does that look like? I would imagine that it's very fragmented because there's different nations utilizing space.
There's certainly space debris and different policies that a number of nations are advocating for, and there needs to be more policy clarity on that. So not only how do you put how do you put systems into space, but how do you sort of dispose of them? How do you make sure that they're not creating more space debris out there? It's a big challenge, and you add, we're talking a lot about cyber and how do you exploit cyber systems on the ground, but in actual space, there's space debris as well as some adversarial capabilities that are happening. So it is becoming more and more contested space, some on purpose and some more accidentally.
Yeah. I guess part of the challenge is, Evan, it's hard for us to conceptualize, those of us on the ground on planet Earth, and really understanding the dynamics that take place in space. So how are market players within the space economy addressing these issues?
So it depends on who the stakeholder is. Right. Civil stakeholders think about the environment very differently, of course, than military stakeholders think about it differently than commercial stakeholders. But to Raz's point, those operators all exist in the same domain. There is no sovereign space. It's very, very different than the maritime domain and very different than the air domain, where you can cordon off areas and protect those areas in more, let's say, ways that are more rooted in tradition and practice and regulatory frameworks. In space, everybody is operating in the same domain across domains. And when one thing happens, maybe that is a contested act, it has broad reaching effects across the rest of the domain, and not just in space, but also affects ground users, maritime users, air users. A great example of this, of sort of the indiscriminate nature of space attacks in particular, was the 2022 KA-SAT Viasat attack, which was a Russian suspected state-sponsored attack against the Viasat network. It wiped out well over 10,000 terminals. It was a denial of service attack, and significantly affected Viasat's ability to deliver services in Europe. But it was originally targeted to disrupt the command and control and BMC2 networks for the Ukrainian military preceding the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But it was indiscriminate. It affects SCADA networks in Germany. It affected networks and air traffic control networks in France, et cetera. So the space domain is sort of one of these soft underbellies of the market and needs to be protected. And that means that commercial operators in particular, who are largely on the receiving end of early attacks, military systems often aren't. It's actually commercial operators that are operating at dual use capacity, have to seriously think about defending themselves and protecting not just their ability to continue to deliver services, but the broader domain and national security interests in which they operate.
Interesting. I thought it would have been the other way around. I'm glad you brought up that distinction there. Araz, let's talk about SatCat. And of course, this is this type of solution that incorporates a number of factors into it, situational awareness being one of them.
Going back to what Evan and Ian said about space traffic. So again, as I mentioned earlier, space doesn't belong to a sovereign nation, right? So, and unfortunately, since the 70s, we haven't been able to really get together as nations and pass a treaty that will kind of coordinate our operations in space. And that's mostly due to kind of one of the challenges that we talked about, the dual use nature of it, right? So as a result, you have these operators that have to operate in space anyway. You're commercial companies, you're providing service to your customers, and you do need to basically use the best technology out there and best data out there to operate on a daily basis. And SATCAT has an effort to offer that. So SATCAT aggregates data from various data sources, from open source sources, as well as proprietary data sources such as US government's databases, satellite operators, GPS-based data, commercial data providers, both sensors on the ground and in space. And also it brings these suites of capabilities right off the bat to operators. Now, the biggest offering of SATCAT, and what we're hoping to use SATCAT to solve a big problem for all operators, is that coordinating between operators across borders has been a massive challenge. If you have what's called a conjunction or a close approach between two satellites. So if you know that two satellites, one from US, one from Europe, will have a close approach in 2 days, you really need to coordinate between the two to figure out who is going to stay the course and who's going to get out of the way. Because if you don't do that, if both operators can perform the same type of maneuver, they could actually increase the risk of a collision instead of reducing. And a SATCAT does that on an automatic and automatic fashion between operators. So the reason I'm talking about this is to talk about this problem, right? The problem of coordinating space operations between civil, commercial, intelligence, defense agencies, and across borders is a massive problem that has been unsolved, and both industry and also government agencies are trying to solve this globally.
Yeah. So, Ian, really what the takeaway here is cybersecurity, as we think of it on the ground, is a much different exercise because of the variables and the elements that exist in space.
Yeah, 100%. So we think about space systems, a lot is happening through software, through automation. There's not people like turning knobs and dials anymore. It's really through a lot of software that's being happening. And software is the cyber domain. It is vulnerable. Human phishing attacks and like breaches, that is, one of the weakest links that we can think about. So how do we think about cyber? How do we think about the right training? We talked about dual use versus sort of national security implications. Why is dual use is maybe a little bit less rigorous in some of the different areas. So then that provides risk. And on top of that, really thinking about what's next for cyber risk is post-quantum. And if you've got satellites that have been out there for quite a while, are they crypto agile? Can we push updates to secure that channel, or is that just going to be assumed to be breached? So all these things are happening at once, and it just makes the domain more contested.
Yeah. I mean, Evan, from a policy perspective, how is this being approached, at least in the US? Because it makes you wonder who owns the data in space, right? Because it appears to me from the conversation that we're having that multiple nations can have access to a large amount of the data.
I think to pull the thread on cyber is really important here. In 2020 really was the last time the United States put together a framework for thinking through the protection of space systems. It was SPD 5, Space Policy Directive 5, released under the first Trump administration. It really, for the first time, tried to articulate what standard space systems and ground systems needed to be built to accommodate. And it started not just with the spacecraft and its flight software protection and link protection on the ground, but also a consideration of supply chain. So the problem that many operators face isn't just restricted to what happens after a spacecraft launches. It's the ongoing operations and protection of that system, but it's also starts in the factory, and it starts before the factory as subsystems and components are generated that end up becoming the foundations of different types of spacecraft that the United States and its allies build. Unfortunately, many of those supply chains originate in countries that may not be friendly to the United States, or certainly don't have the same incentives to protect those supply chains. And we don't even need to sort of go as far as to say that there's nefarious activity. There is, to be clear, but also we're just kind of concerned about counterfeit parts. And those counterfeit parts also expose a cyber surface that is rather unique in the space domain.
Araz, what about the impact of AI?
Well, it's a question that everybody's trying to answer. Well, obviously with AI, being able to look at the data and extract intelligence and also information that's not visible to human eye or human analysis, that opens a big door into both on the positive side to be able to make spaceflight safer in general in our case, or open it to more nefarious activities, right? So if using AI and capabilities, you can predict what a certain asset is going to do, that gives you an edge on being able to interrupt it or get involved and leverage it for your own good. So the short answer is I don't know. The long, everybody's trying to figure out how we can protect ourselves when all these new technologies, including quantum and AI, are advancing so quickly. So it's going to be used both as an offensive and also defensive weapons.
Yeah. Ian, interesting question though. Do we have the skill set and the talent to execute on the cybersecurity needs in space? This sounds more complex than any other cybersecurity scenario that I've covered, at least.
I think the talent is there. It needs to be the skill and the will. So these are all sort of known computing problems. So you can solve it with the right investment. The question is, who's going to pay for it? Is it the vendors? Is it going to be the end customer? Is it going to be the government? Who's going to fund that cyber defense of the space domain? So it is, all these problems can come down to, just general sort of cyber practices, encryption, networking, communications. But it's a question of where the resource is going to come from.
Right. So, Evan, certainly it's a public-private partnership that we're looking at here. It's not one or the other.
That's absolutely right. I think every operator in the domain has a responsibility to protect themselves, and government customers that are using commercial industry capabilities have an obligation to at least think through and articulate the way in which commercial space systems that are being utilized in a dual-use fashion are going to be protected once targeted by our adversaries should a low-grade conflict or a significant conflict kick off. It's essential, and we're really at the early stages of thinking through that. There are some efforts within the United States Space Force and beyond in particular that are starting to, for the first time, articulate how wartime protection might occur. The Lloyd's in particular has thought through this. Unfortunately, they chose to exclude state-sponsored cyber attacks from coverage following the KSAT Viasat network attack, which I think was an interesting development. But there's a broad set of responsibilities for protecting and defending the space domain and preserving it for future generations.
All right. Appreciate all of your insights. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.